Alright, pardon the attire, I just woke up and I haven't had a chance to comb my hair or anything yet. Um, I want to talk, I really think this will be a briefer video than normal. Although a lot of you say you like the longer videos, that's not always necessary. Um, about a month ago I finished a book, a history book. Here it is, Japan's Imperial Army, its rise and fall, 1853 to 1945. Um, some people, when I made my videos on the Civil War, have kind of come and asked, what book should I read if I want to learn about, say, the Civil War. I think if you want to learn about history, you have to read a lot of books, and if you want to do it in any way systematically, you're going to have to pick a particular topic, say the Civil War, do a little research on what are the best sources on that, and then start to comprehensively cover it. So on the Civil War, there are one or two really good books that kind of cover the whole war in a broad way. Probably the best would be Shelby Foote's narrative on the Civil War, which it's 3 volumes long. It's probably 5,000 pages or more. But you could read that, and then you could maybe read a couple books about the economics of the Civil War, say Banks and Politics in the Civil War, or Mark Thornton's book on it. Maybe read a couple biographies about some of the key figures. Read a couple books about slavery. Read a couple books detailing specific battles, like probably the Battle of Gettysburg or Vicksburg, or uh, you know, um, I read a book when I was in 4th grade about the Battle of Chickamauga, and that didn't just make me learn about the Battle of Chickamauga. It made me learn about the lead up to the battle, the various armies involved, the commanders involved, the conditions, that sort of thing. And eventually you get to the point where you feel like, okay, I have a pretty good handle on this, and then you can go pick another topic like World War I, or the Fed, or the Revolutionary War, or the antebellum period. The one thing you don't want to do is read world history books and then come away thinking you've got it all figured out. Marxists tend to do this. People tend to read Howard Zinn and they think they've pretty much got American history figured out. And I had on my Civil War video, some Marxists started commenting that the Civil War was actually waged because the North wanted to impose wage slavery on the South. They didn't like chattel slavery. They wanted everyone to be a wage slave. And the reason, 1 million Northerners or more volunteered for the Army was to uh, enforce wage slavery. And I said, I've read lots of contemporary, not to mention, authors, but contemporary records of the Civil War. And when Northerners talk about their motivation for fighting, it always is to preserve the Union, to suppress the rebellion, and among a minority, it's to free the slaves, but certainly without the further condition to extend wage slavery, unless you just want to say that that's implicit in those arguments. And I kept bringing this up, and I said, "What is your source on the claim that the Civil War, the primary motivation of the North was to uh, extend the wage slavery system?" And he gave me a source, and it was called like the History of the World, and it was by a socialist journalist in the UK. So here's a guy who all he writes are books that equate world history to match Marxist presuppositions. He's a journalist. He's not a Civil War historian or a U.S. historian or anything like that. And I'm not one to stand on he doesn't have a degree. He doesn't study it very often. Then he writes a book of the entire history of the world that's probably what 300 or 400 pages long, or maybe double that, and that's supposed to be a convincing argument. No, and I said, look, I have the Oxford University Ancient History of the World series. It's like 24 volumes long, and each book is almost 1,000 pages. And that's only ancient history, and that's only in the Western Hemisphere. Like I said, Shelby Foote has a 5,000 page book just about the Civil War. There's a really great documentary about the Civil War called The Civil War by Ken Burns. That's 12 hours long. I mean, you just go through. You don't want to just read a world history book and figure you've got it. I mean, you're going to have to pick a particular topic. So, in that vein, if you look at the subtitle on this book, it's covering almost 100 years. What is that? Uh, Fuck, I can't do the math. 87 years, 88 years, and that's pretty broad. But my knowledge about Japanese history is pretty limited. Because they were in World War II, I know a lot about World War II, and I thought, well, I'd like to get a little bit broader picture, and this book does it because it basically covers all those decades and it gives an equal weight to all of them. So this isn't a book that has one chapter which a normal book about World War II will probably have maybe one chapter preceding the war, and then the rest of the book is about World War II. In this one, every decade starting in the 1850s has about the same amount of space going all the way up to the 1840s, or the 1940s. And so it gives you a broader picture, which isn't super accurate, but it gives you a kind of context and a starting point from which to get further studies. And it did. I mean, just reading this book, I got interested in other more specific topics, and went ahead and purchased a number of books that will cover those in more detail. So this first part of this video is kind of a separate part to where I actually wanted to go with this, but if you're interested in learning history, I think it's good to read more basic texts first, and as you read them, to make notes on what would be interesting, what you're curious about, what you want greater elaboration on, and then go on from there. And if you are interested in Japanese history, this is not a bad place to start. Now, this is, of course, only recent history. It's not talking about the shogunate or the Tokugawas or the anything like that. Just references are made to it, but you got to start somewhere. So what I wanted to talk about is I always found the Japanese theater really compelling in World War II because the Japanese military and the Japanese society was clearly fighting a war that they couldn't win. The armed forces of the United States, the material that they were able to marshal, was so much more than the Japanese that it's really interesting. I mean, they had all these Japanese military bases were being squashed like bugs by the U.S. Navy and Army. And in popular culture in the United States, there seems to be this tendency to want to view this is somehow a surprise, like the Japanese got in a war with the United States with as little foresight as if they had gotten a war with Thailand or something, and then it just turned out to be this big surprise that, oh, the United States is powerful, and that they just kind of stumbled into it. The quote, which is actually not attributable to Yamamoto, is that they have awoken a sleeping giant, and that they just didn't know that the United States was going to be this strong. This is, of course, completely wrong. The potential power of the United States, or the actual power for that matter, was very well known and was not underestimated, really. The idea that they would be able to easily surpass the production of whatever war material you'd like to talk about was acknowledged. In the book, where is it? In this book, The Wages of Destruction by Adam Totes, this is about Nazi Germany. He basically argues that the entire philosophy of Adolf Hitler is made in a reaction to the reality of American hegemony. So it wasn't like they didn't know America was strong. The power of America and also the USSR were new geopolitical realities. Someone like Hitler was like, well, we need to cope with this, and the way we're going to cope with it is to become our own United States by conquering all this land. The Japanese didn't have an identical kind of view of empire. But why I think this is compelling is because if it was known that it was going to be suicidal or futile, and that the result that happened was the likely result, indeed the near certain result, why would they go to war then? And I think that's what's compelling about it. Not just the massive amount of destruction, but just the idea that how can people do these suicidal things, essentially? You know, walk into it. They were on a path into here for a long time. Now, what reading this book did, and my smart PC cleaner is kind of give me a better understanding of why this happened. And I think it's pertinent because the things that the Japanese and the Germans did are the same things that all governments do even today. Um, just to kind of sum up the history of Japan at this point, you know, Japan had been isolated. It had been this society that was, you know, basically not too concerned about foreigners. And then in the mid 19th century, American and European powers started to become involved in Japan, and it was very, very obvious that the military superiority of these Western powers was such that the Tokugawa shogunate was in no position to really thwart them. They could come and go as they pleased, and they did. I mean, they didn't actually conquer Japan, but if some trading ship would come in and say, "Well, we want to trade with this," and the shogun said no, they would just, you know, wipe out his local garrison and allow themselves to trade. And there was really nothing that the Japanese government could do about it. So this facilitated a crisis because of the shogun's inability to you know, cope with foreigners, that eventually led to a series of rebellions, one of which was led by basically samurai from southern Japan, from Kyushu and Chosun, but Kyushu at least. They kind of took the emperor, who was kind of a vestigial, almost pope-like figure, used him as a figurehead as the justification for their rebellion, and eventually they took power. What followed was a very haphazard but rapid, nonetheless rapid, modernization of the Japanese military. This is very hard because they were doing a shift from a feudal samurai class type military to, you know, what we call a modern state army. And it didn't happen real smoothly. If you ever watch the movie The Last Samurai, it's kind of taking place in this period, although it exaggerates. By that time in the 1870s or even in the early 1880s, I forget when that movie takes place, Japan was a little bit more modernized than that movie likes to depict, but it's only off by a decade or two. The immediate goal of this modernization was to make Japan into a position where it would be able to resist a foreign invasion. The idea being, what if the Russians, and these were the people who became the chief potential antagonists, what if the Russians, or perhaps the English, who had started to have a strong naval presence, you know, they would want to be able to repel an invasion on Japanese soil. Eventually, the modernization got to the point where this was the case. They were able to develop modern enough artillery, mostly by buying it from Europeans, but, you know, to make enough of their own, and modern enough fortifications and modern weapons and tactics, that they were able to get military forces that would have been very, very successful in repelling any likely invasion to Japan. So by, say, the 1880s, this was probably the case. But this kind of showed, and this is why I think this is relevant, because you get a military, you get a government, and they start doing one thing, and the next thing you know, they find other justifications for their existence. And so in their case, it became, well, we could repel an invasion now, but it sure would be nice if we could just prevent the potential enemy from having a base to launch that invasion. That would be even better. And this meant that Korea and northern China and Sakhalin Islands and basically Oriental Russia would be areas that they would want to control to one degree or another. And so this came to a war first with China, which Japan won, and then in 1905, or maybe it started in 1904, a war with Russia. Now, in the West, the war with Russia is always kind of depicted as the underdog Japanese mopping the floor with the Russians, and this is actually not accurate. This is one thing I learned from this book that I didn't know, because the way it's depicted in the West, the Japanese just mopped the floor with the Russians. This is not true. The Russians already were modernizing. They had enough impact with the most modern European armies that they were using. For instance, concrete bunkers, machine guns, grenades, artillery. And the Japanese were fighting basically with almost Civil War or post-Civil War type uh, percussion cap rifles and not machine guns. And uh, it was a really hard fought war. The Japanese basically though realized we can't ever actually win. In order for us to win, we'd have to occupy St. Petersburg and Moscow, and we have no way of doing that. The Russians, though, since it was such a big fiasco, since they weren't able to crush the Japanese right away, eventually came to the negotiating table, which gave Theodore Roosevelt a Peace Prize. One of the most, it's not as ironic as Obama getting it, but nearly so. In any event, the Japanese basically annexed Korea because of this, or near thereafter. But then now that they, okay, well, we know we can repel any invasion of our homeland. And now we have the main potential base for that, which is Korea. But then they start to look around like, but to keep Korea safe, then we really need to talk about northern China, what is today called Manchuria. And so they became very interested in Manchuria. There's a lot of economic development there. And, of course, there were Chinese there, and many of the Chinese became basically proxies, if not puppets, of the Japanese. And eventually, in military circles, the strategic thinkers in the military start looking at this and saying, okay, well, it would be good for us if Manchuria became, if we had all their resources, if we had all their population, maybe we could develop an industrial base there, and that would be really advantageous to us. So basically the military, without the approval of the main Japanese government, essentially orchestrated an invasion and occupation of Manchuria, which led to the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo that started in 1931. And you'd think then at this point, well, we've come a long way from just defending Japan at this point. We're talking about occupying an area much larger than Japan. However, this invasion of Manchuria obviously pissed off the Chinese and led to extreme hostilities with the Chinese, basically low-scale warfare that eventually erupted into outright total warfare in 1937. It also made the Soviet Union their main enemy because now they shared a long border with the Soviet Union. And the Japanese got in a couple of border conflicts with the Soviet Union, all of which they lost terribly. These are not well known in the West. I've heard about them before. This is the first time I really got a sense of how inferior the Japanese were to the Soviets. They had basically division-sized units that were more or less getting annihilated in the Soviet Union, in Inner Mongolia. The most famous place is called Kölkön Gol, but there are a couple others. And then the military starts saying, well, geez, Manchuria is nice, but we really still don't have the resources to stop the Russians. The border with Russia via Manchukuo is pretty long. So if however, we had all the resources of China, then we might be able to win a war with the Russians. And so in the military, the idea again began to spread that the key to holding Manchuria, which the only point of which was to maybe make it easier to defend Japan, is now to be had in controlling China. And this led to the war with China. It wasn't explicitly declared for a long time. It was called the China Incident in Japan for up until the actual war with the United States in 1941. And the next thing you know, there are millions of Japanese troops invading large sections of coastal and even inland China. And in the name of kind of securing their flank, they end up bogging down their entire army. Or near enough is not to matter. They had double and triple mobilization, and they are locked in a war with China that really, really they can't win. China is too big, it's too vast, there's too many people. There were communists under Mao, but they were relatively minor in importance. The government of Chiang Kai-shek was as corrupt and inefficient as it was, had too many resources at its disposal. That several times they conquered the capital that Chiang would use, and Chiang would just move farther inland, farther afield, to a more defensible place, and they'd have to attack that. And it's not a bridge too far; it's a fucking province too far. They just ended up way. It was a horrible situation. Well, then the thinking started to become, maybe, they weren't getting the resources from China that they wanted. In fact, the economic exploitation in China was only ever enough to mostly sustain the occupying Japanese forces. So the net effect was zero. They weren't getting tons of resources from China. It was more of a ulcer or an abscess than a net gain for the society. So then the Navy started saying, well, all the resources are not in northern China, they're in the South Pacific, and what is today in Indonesia, but back then was the Dutch East Indies, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines. These are the places where all the resources are. And so they said, well, if we had those resources, then we'd be able to have enough industrial base that maybe we'd be able to resist the Russians. Well, doing that meant going to war with Great Britain and with France and with the United States. Now, that's insane, but the logical progression of these years of militarism, these years of giving the strategic thinking of the military first billing, so to speak, in terms of the national conversation, leads to this. And with the German defeat of several of the European powers, especially France and the Netherlands, and the distraction of the UK, they never defeated the UK, but the UK had priorities, and they were in Europe, not in Singapore. The Japanese started to say, well, this might be our chance. Of course, this had the tying down of the Europeans did not tie down the Americans, which was clear. But they find themselves in, okay, well, right now we're in a situation, we're bogged down in a war with China. If we don't have some kind of decisive moment here, the minute the Russians decide to attack us, we're in deep, deep trouble, because we do not have the wherewithal to fight the Russians. Which is why, by the way, the main reason they did not help the Germans, because they had been so readily defeated by the Russians. Even at the height of the German invasion of the Soviet Union still had about 700,000 soldiers in the Far East to defend against the Japanese forces in Manchuria, which would have numbered less than half of that. So that's just another indication of the relative strength of the Soviet Union to a country like Germany, that they can hold, and not just the ones in the Far East, but literally millions of active duty military in peace zones, places where they're not actually even fighting. So the Japanese had this enormous gamble that basically explicitly required that the Germans defeat the English and the Soviets. And the idea was, if the English were defeated, the Americans will become discouraged, which they would become discouraged, but to what degree isn't clear. And so they go ahead and launch this war, even though any rational look at it would be that it's suicide. And it's just a culmination of years of military thinking. And we have the same thing in the United States now, where they look at the world, and 50 years ago is, okay, well, we have to be able to resist the Soviet threat, which was exaggerated but real. And now the Soviet Union's gone, and it's like, well, okay, we don't just retreat now. Now we have to extend our influence, and so they try and spread NATO. They try and spread our border. The defensive border of the United States is fucking not 12 miles off the shore or whatever. It's Taiwan to South Korea to, like, the enemies that they have in mind are Russia and China still. Even though we do commerce with them, if you're a military thinker, then you just think this way, And then you start thinking about things like the strategic value of the Persian Gulf, and that's not the sole reason that I'm not saying this is the only reason we're in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that thinking, that kind of geopolitical chess match that they like to play with the corpses of millions, really factors highly in the thinking of the political elite, the military establishment, and we all pay the price for their hubris and for their lack of vision, to quote an evil emperor in a famous movie. Um, so I think it's important to look at these past precedents. The Germans, they didn't have identical goals or ideology to the Japanese. I think sometimes people kind of conflate their similarities too much. Uh, but it's a similar process of, well, we want X, Y, and Z, and once you take the step to X, you really can't. You don't want to go back, and so you keep going. And so wasn't enough to take Korea, and it wasn't enough to take Manchuria, and it wasn't enough to take China, although they never fully took China. By the time they got in the war with the United States, they were like a person who was midway through a Twister game. They already were tied down in China pretty bad, and yet they risked this war with a far more powerful opponent, and the results were predictable and tragic for both sides, but mostly for them. I mean, for every American who died, that were killed by the Japanese, hundreds of Japanese were killed. Um, and got to the point where the Americans were just wiping out Japanese urban centers one after another. I'm not even talking about the atomic bombs. And that was a predictable conclusion. But military people think in military terms, and the government is very deferential to the military. The Japanese government was more deferential to the military than ours currently is, but that's the trend is that the military in the United States is getting more and more valuable because most Americans have a dismissive or negative view of the general domestic government, but not a similar view of the military. The military is kind of viewed as the better part of government, the least impeachable, and that's very, very dangerous. So anyway, it's not even half an hour, but I'm going to call it quits at this. So that's it.